Welcome to Cybersecurity Sense, a weekly podcast providing updates and insight into the latest in cybersecurity. Brought to you by LBMC Information Security. Now, here's your host.
Welcome, everyone. This is Jason and Mark from LBMC Information Security. In this episode, we're going to share a little feedback with you on some things that we're seeing out in the field. Hopefully, we'll have a recommendation or two that might be of use to you. And then after that, we're going to segue the discussion into something that Mark and I have been discussing together and that we see as being on the horizon for those of us in the cybersecurity community, and something that you at least want to be aware of because we think it's going to be a problem sometime in the near future. So first, on the feedback front, one of the things that Mark and I do on a regular basis, we both have different skill sets, but the two big things are either cybersecurity incident response, or in Mark's case, a lot of audit and cybersecurity preparedness, helping organizations get their defenses in order and make sure they're meeting their compliance obligations. I would say for the last 6 months, at least, maybe even a little bit longer than that, there's a trend that we're starting to see that people really need to take seriously. And I know that folks are starting to hear more about it out in industry, but we're going to jump onto the pile and weigh in on, from our standpoint, on something that we think is very important for you to consider. And that is, with the move to the cloud, and a lot of organizations starting to put their critical workloads, if they haven't already, beginning to move more stuff to the cloud, we're seeing a lot of user authentication compromises where a username and a password is accessed by a bad actor. The bad guys get hold of somebody in your organization's username and password. Oftentimes that's through a phishing attack. Could be stolen credentials that are dumped out to an internet site for other people to use. But the big thing there is, if your organization has sensitive information that can be accessed from anywhere on the internet using just a username and password, then you're at risk. A biggest example of this that I see today is Microsoft Office 365. Most organizations that I work with have begun to move their email out to the cloud or are already hosting everything in Microsoft Office 365. And many of those will allow folks on the internet to access the O365 cloud directly without having to go to their organization through a VPN connection or something like that. And that can open them up to if these credential thefts. If the bad guys do get access to a username password combination, they can theoretically access those mailboxes from anywhere on the planet using those stolen credentials. So two-factor authentication, multi-factor authentication is something that you've heard us talk a lot about. My strong plead to you is to take a look at any type of remote access, either into your organization's on-premise systems or your sensitive cloud service provider offerings, and make sure that you've got multi-factor authentication enabled there.
Yeah, Jason, I think historically, when we talked about MFA or dual factor, we were, as auditors, targeting accounts with high privileges in the past, and what we're seeing now is that's just not enough. With the way that attackers can get in, move laterally, and find other ways to these to compromise these systems. Just focusing our multi-factor on those administrator accounts is not enough. So it's a great control, and one that we all need to be looking at in terms of adoption much more broadly than we have in the past.
Absolutely. So now getting to the forecast, if you will, get our crystal ball out. One of the things Mark and I were talking about over the last few weeks is back up for a bit of a history lesson. So if you think of the last 10 years or so in cybersecurity, you've got these three pillars of information security: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. I would say for the first 5 to 8 years of the past decade, most of the attacks that we've seen in the cyberspace have been laser focused on the confidentiality. It's been data breaches, data disclosure, data access by unauthorized individuals, data theft. That's been where most of the pain has been. And then maybe in the last 5 years, with a firm ramp up into the present, we've seen the advent of crypto ransomware attacks that have targeted availability. So now instead of data being disclosed to somebody being the big pain point, you've got the availability of that data. Oftentimes the data you need to run your business being held hostage until you pay the ransom and the bad guys unlock it. Well, for me, it was the Equifax breach that got my wheels turning on this. And I started talking to Mark, and then we heard a member of the local FBI cyber squad give a speech at a local conference, and he even commented on the same thing, and he applied it to healthcare. But it's the concept of data integrity. Yeah, it's not something that most cybersecurity folks focus on. It's more the availability or the confidentiality. And frankly, I know I skew towards the confidentiality side, but Mark, what do you think? If bad guys are able to impact the integrity of data, what does that look like for us?
Yeah, it's kind of scary. And, we've talked a lot about CIA, and to your point, Jason, I think I don't know if we've ignored integrity, but it certainly hasn't been top of mind. But as we have seen over the last few years, really some very notable incidents. I mean, you think back, even though this is kind of nation state, and even though it's not the nation that we would expect, you think back to Stuxnet and the ability of malicious code to impact command and control and give false data and some of the implications of that for industry. It's really scary.
It was saying, instead of saying status is bad, warning danger, it was repeating back, even in a danger condition, status is green, everything's A-OK. And if you're familiar with that attack, you know what the end result was. Those systems spun out of control until they caused actual physical damage. So that's pretty amazing that was actually an integrity attack.
Yeah, and we associate that sort of thing often with nation states, and in that case it probably was. But there are other examples too. Back in 2013, I actually didn't remember this, but as I was doing a little research for this talk, I was reminded that the AP had their Twitter account taken over. And just some brief tweets from that very notable, very public account about a supposed incident at the White House, and the president had been evacuated and maybe even harmed. It caused a tremendous drop in the stock market, just over a matter of minutes. And, billions of dollars in equity they just vanished. And you think about, even though that was recovered fairly quickly, the ability to impact markets through these data integrity attacks is really a scary thing.
Yeah, that's actually that was the aha moment for me when I was giving a presentation. I think it was 2 days after the Equifax breach was announced. So I couldn't ignore that elephant in the room, and I had to talk about it. And it was through both giving that talk and then talking to some of the conference attendees afterwards that we were kind of brainstorming and riffing on this idea, what if it had happened differently? And one of the things that we were hypothesizing about was, what if a nation state, an adversarial nation to the U.S., had been responsible for that attack, and instead of it unfolding the way it did, they were a bit more covert, a little more stealthy about it, and they had actually manipulated data in a way so that, you take middle-class America, the people that are typically applying for credit, which is what Equifax does. They give us a credit score and opine on our credit worthiness. If they were able to take the people that had a 200 credit score and the people that had a 700 credit score and swap those and do it in such a way that it wasn't easy to detect, and all of a sudden people that should have been denied loans start getting them, and those that should get them were denied, might cause a bit of uncertainty and discontent, and could impact the stock market. The loss of confidence in everybody's ability to extend credit, probably something that would cause a dip in the overall the market.
Yeah, and if you think about it, it seems to it could be a natural evolution of attacks as well. In some ways, they could be much more effective than availability attacks and confidentiality attacks when you think about what's at stake. If you're able to move markets, you can put positions in those markets to achieve far greater financial gain through that sort of manipulation than you could by obtaining confidential information and assuming identities and that sort of thing.
Absolutely. And then you think about we mentioned the crypto ransomware a little bit earlier. It's focused on just the availability of the data. Think about a ransomware type of attack where instead of data availability, they go in and instead of encrypting everything, they monkey with the integrity and they tell a company, all right, we've changed all your data. We're not going to change it back until you pay this extremely large ransom. If you apply that to something like a healthcare company, a healthcare provider, maybe a hospital, and they do the patient monitoring systems that they use for monitoring someone during surgery, much like the Stuxnet. So when somebody's going into cardiac arrest, or I'm not a physician, but just work with me on the example here, that the system reports back that everything's fine. So maybe their pulse is a lot lower than they think it is, and people start having adverse effects. So it's a bit of a stretch, but it's not too far away, I think, from where we might be headed.
Well, and it's scary too, considering IoT now. The attack surface is so much greater now with the Internet of Things than we had historically, and often those things, whatever they might be, it might be a biomedical device, they're sort of out of band of our typical, or out of reach of some of our typical controls that we have in place around devices that we might directly own and manage. So there was a research firm I was reading about. They'd done an analysis on some of these IoT devices. And, some of the scenarios you see in the disaster movies where a hacker has obtained access to the city's grid for traffic signals. Well, they actually found that there were over 200,000 vulnerable traffic control sensors in major metropolitan areas in the United States. So, I mean, just think about that, and maybe think about that in conjunction with all of the autonomous vehicles that we might have on the road one day. It's mind-boggling, actually, to see all of these, potentially see all of these autonomous vehicles pointed in one direction, or maybe all of those traffic lights turning green at the same time.
Yeah, IoT is definitely something that broadens the scope there for us. You mentioned medical devices there for a second too, and that's one thing. We do a lot of work in the healthcare industry, and that's something I know I've run into is when we're helping clients with a cybersecurity issue. Invariably, we get to a point where we can't do something with those medical devices because you can say they're unmanaged, or the ability to manage is severely restricted by the vendor that's supplying them. So those are definitely a pain point, and that seems like that would be a logical attack vector for the bad guys at some point. So interesting.
Well, I think it's easy to talk about these scenarios, and many times those of us in the security industry are accused of spreading fear and uncertainty and doubt and FUD. And I don't think we want to do that. But at the same time, when we start thinking about some of the implications of these integrity attacks, they are a bit scary, and we need to be paying attention. I think the takeaway here, or one of the takeaways, though, is that largely the blocking and tackling that we need to be doing around security and hygiene of data protection, they're the same. So they're the same whether we're trying to protect availability or confidentiality or integrity. I think if anything, though, this should serve as a bit of a wake-up call that we need to ratchet our efforts up. Largely because of the tremendous impact that some of these new attacks can have.
Yeah, definitely something folks need to start taking into account in their risk assessments, I think. Most companies have to do a formal risk assessment on usually an annual basis. And I review a lot of those, as I know you do too. And I would say that much like this discussion, most of the risks that we take a look at are focused on probably confidentiality, and after that, availability. If you're not taking integrity risks into account, definitely something that needs to be added to your process.
Yeah, I think what we'll see as more and more of these types of attacks begin to proliferate is that the regulators will their interest will be piqued as well, and we'll be held. Those of us who are charged with protecting data will be held accountable by the regulators should we have some type of a breach, be it something like we've heard about recently with Equifax, where we've got concerns about identity theft, or be it something potentially more serious with these integrity attacks. So I think it behooves us all, as we're thinking about the data that we've been entrusted with, that we're making sure we've got good controls around that.
So thanks, Mark. Hopefully that's helpful to those of you listening. Just to recap very quickly, if you're not using multi-factor authentication on all your remote access entry points to either your organization or your cloud providers, you definitely want to take a look at that and implement that as reasonably quickly as you can. And then, as we talked about a moment ago, you definitely want to take a look at integrity attacks and what potential might there be for that to be a point of risk exposure for your organization. So thanks again for joining us today. I hope you've enjoyed the content. This is the first one for Mark and I to do together, and based on my experience, I think we'll be doing several more of those in the future. If you'd like to see some of our other podcasts, you can check us out either on our website, which is lbmcinformationsecurity.com, or check us out on iTunes under LBMC Cybersecurity Sense. Thanks a lot, and so long for now.